First, I want to start off by saying thank you so much for having me. I always start these conversations off with kind of set the expectation. I don't believe that I have all the answers, but I've wrestled with this topic of racial diversity myself. I've experienced it, and feel like all of us here have something to bring to the table in terms of our understanding of this and moving the conversation forward. So I say that I don't have all the answers, but hopefully this conversation will be engaging for you and give you a lens and a framework to think about this issue differently. So, as Susan said, a little bit about me. I'm a co-founder of Brown Venture Group. We started in 2018. And really, we started out the Brown Venture Group from a data point, and that is that 3% of venture capital actually goes into Black and Brown founders. Now, I wanted to know why this was. I like to be data informed and data driven, but really this whole area of behavior science helped me with this lens of actually how to see this problem. And I'll start by saying this. Right now, if I tell you that I work with at-risk youth, what's the first image that comes to mind? What's the first face that you see? Exactly. The very language that we use to describe, as I call us, contributors of color, becomes deterministic. How far do you push somebody who's at risk to reach their full potential? It turns out not very far. Many people have viewed this lack of opportunity and stopped trying to solve the problem. And that's one of the biggest challenges we face today. The problem of racial inequity is so large, but people have a hard time cognitively solving the problem. And today we want to talk about how we can narrow those down to simplifying it. And it really starts off by creating friendships. Going back to this data point over here, 3% of venture capital goes into entrepreneurs of color. Does that mean that there's a lack of talent? No. What it actually shows is that there's actually a lack of relationship. Many contributors cannot think or recall to mind a person of color that owns a business, that has an investable company. And it's because someone made a decision a long time ago how easy it was for you and I, being a white person and a brown person, to become friends. And that we call redlining. Redlining, we know the effects, how it's affected communities of color, but if you think about it, it also made it challenging for us to find investable companies and talent to hire for our companies, because we can't think of people in our sphere. If you pause for a moment and think, how many people of color do you know right now? Some of us, it's not very many, right? But is that whose fault is that really? People try to put a blame. It goes back to a lot of the historics that have occurred in our society, redlining, black codes, and others that have prevented relationship from forming. And as a result, all of us have paid for it. That's where the $13 trillion of business revenue has come to, is because we haven't had these opportunities to build relationships. We see from the data points, there's also a tremendous upside. Black and brown founders have higher success rates, not because they're better in and of itself, it's because people oftentimes pick over the relationships they already know. So if you went to an Ivy League school, you kind of have that network. And if those people at the Ivy League school are all white, guess what? You're not going to go too far beyond your friends. Let's think about how we hire people at companies. It's all about, as sophisticated as we can get with our hiring practices, it always goes back to a relationship, right? This is why important relationship forming is so important. So the question really is here, what life-saving technologies or breakthrough innovations have we not seen as a result of cultural biases, right? There have been people who have been precluded from getting investments precisely because they've been viewed as highly risky. Well, if we see that $13 trillion of business revenue, and people, as I'm talking to folks, sometimes I'll hear people say, well, we have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders, right? To our constituents. What that translates to is I actually haven't done the thick thinking, the hard thinking to realize where is actually the opportunities, because if it's not a part of my circle, I have a hard time going outside of that. Now the challenge is how do we move beyond that? Is being more intentional. And these cognitive biases are all over the place. That's why I lead with the example of when I say I work with at-risk youth, what's the image that comes to mind? Here's an interesting thing too I want to talk about. Many folks, after the death of George Floyd, rushed out and obviously made commitments and said, we got to change this thing. We have to change what's been going on. But historically, what we've seen is people have been doing things for communities of color and not doing things with. When you do things for communities of color, it's a project. When you do things with communities of color, it's a partnership. And what we're saying in our communities, we don't need sympathy, we need opportunity. Opportunity is an event. Capacity is what you can do with that event. And the reality is that there's many people with high capacity that haven't been given the opportunity, which is an event. So at Brown Venture Group, we're trying to increase the events that contributors of color have to innovate and not only affect our community, but create economic and human flourishing for everybody. See, that's the thing. It's not about a black and white thing. It's about unleashing the full economic capability of everybody. I like the words we used when we first started here, contributors. Every single person here is a contributor. You may have a different hue, but you are a contributor, and we want to contribute to the vitality of our nation just like everyone else. And that's the shift in thinking that we really need to focus on. Let's move from doing things for communities of color versus doing things with communities of color, and you'll find better results. So Brown Venture Group, we started back in 2018. We started this idea of let's create an accelerator for communities of color. Let's be the Techstar or Y Combinator specifically for black and brown entrepreneurs. What we found is from our research, though, is that many contributors of color do not have friends and family rounds of investment. And if you're an investor, you want to see that somebody in the family has took a risk, right? The fool's round, the friends and family of fools. And if they haven't, that's an indication for you to say, you know what, they're probably not worth investing in. But the reality is, it's because of the economic policies that have been created that we haven't had that transferable wealth. If you have no transferable wealth, you can't get in a playing field. Brown Venture Group, we solved that problem, not only doing from series, seed all the way up, but we actually have our friends and family rounds of investment, meaning we're going to get more people on the playing field that haven't been there before, that need that friends and family rounds of investment, and they can go down to the Impact Hub and get, as we call, business scaffolding to help these entrepreneurs with marketing, with legal, with different things that they need to help ensure that their company succeeds. Excuse me. So this whole idea of free market versus selective capitalism. I love Adam Smith. You guys are going to joke me here a little, probably. I read his book 3 times, believe it or not. I read it 3 times. And I was fascinated because you see that free market capitalism is always about not suppressing or not artificially putting something in place that would inhibit contribution. But what we see in American history is exactly opposite. Why was 40 acres and a mule a government handout, but going with 160 acres to go west, patriotic, right? It's the same thing, but yet it's packaged differently. So why is it that when one group of contributors gets a assistance, it's called welfare system, but it's called a stimulus package when another group of contributors gets that, right? It's the language, and we have to change that because it's not just hurting us, it's hurting everybody. It's not just hurting communities of color. The reality is it's everybody is affected and impacted by racism, and that's why we need to solve this problem together. This idea of selective capitalism, this whole idea of artificially created poverty. Going back to Adam Smith, right? You don't want artificially create nothing. You want free market capitalism to go. But when you have black codes that say you can't vote, when you have economic policies that were created, and then all of a sudden one day we're supposed to forget about it, right? Done. Racism is no longer an issue. There's no longer any historical, multi-generational implications of redlining or any of these factors, but the reality is it has been. And now the expectation is to take free market capitalism and solve, I'm fine for now, thank you, and solve for the problem that was artificially created. But guess what? It wasn't free market capitalism that got us to where we're at today. It was the visible hand of racism and oppression. That's what got us here today. And in order for us to get out of that, we have to be more intentional. Now, I'm not saying we should start going and messing around with the system too much, but the reality is we do need a different way of going forward. Because if we don't, we're going to still have the same cycle. If it wasn't free market capitalism itself that got us out of, it can get us out of there. I wish it was, though. So the friendship gap, this is huge. Most people talk about you're reading White Fragility and other books, they talk about these things that have happened to communities of color, right? But the biggest problem is that there's been a friendship gap that's been created. There was a study done by the Pew Research where 81%, 82% of respondents came back and said, I don't even have a friend of color. Now, before we start going to pointing the finger and say, well, it's probably because you're racist, let's think about it again. What happened historically, right? We came to the United States. We had indigenous folks we broke promises from them. We then brought slaves here and then said, oh, by the way, once we're done with you, how about you go back to Liberia, right? Then we fast forward, we started having redlining, different policies that prevented relationships from naturally forming. And now it's to the point where people can't think of a person of color that they can invest in. It's not because they're not there. We see that black women in particular are one of the most educated group of entrepreneurs and folks, contributors in America today. Yet the investment into contributors of color that are women is something along the lines of 0.0006%, statistically insignificant. They don't even measure investments into indigenous communities. Nobody even tracks that. But there's huge potential that's latent inside there. And the purpose of me telling you is not to make people feel guilty. The purpose of me telling you this is to think about how can I become a more intentional contributor by forming friendships with people that don't look like me. I'll give you a good example. In my faith community, one of the things they talk about is let's go do service projects. They're very important service projects, but let's change the language off of service projects. Let's talk about relationships. And so if you're going to go buy coffee, why not go to a black-owned coffee shop? If you're going to get your hair cut, why not go to a barber and get your hair cut? That's where the community's at. That's where relationship is formed. And then you'll start to realize that there's plenty of opportunities. It's just a relationship needs to be formed. And I'll add to this, many folks, whether or not you're in government or nonprofit or for-profit, want to solve the problem of racial inequality, but everybody's skipping the step of relationship and trying to go straight to problem solving. We can't do that. We have to humanize one another by getting to know one another. We have to understand what it is that communities of color actually want, not assume what they want. And the only way you can do that is slow down so eventually you can go fast. Slow down to get the relationship so eventually you can go faster to get investments of communities of color and to help launch and scale companies that are going to win and be successful. I'll add one more thing as far as the barriers to contribution that exist for communities of color. When many people see athletes and professionals, they say, wow, these folks have made it. But there's something called an anchoring heuristic, an availability heuristic, And this availability heuristic is a rule of thumb that says, I can see Paul Campbell and he's successful. So racism must not be a problem. What it is an overweighting of one set of data at the exclusion of everything else. For every black and brown contributor that makes it out of artificial poverty, there is a ton of family members back at home, back in artificially created ghettos, right? And there's a remittance payments that has to be done. I remember one time my uncle came to my house from Minneapolis and he said, hey, you know, nephew, it takes gas money to get over here, right? Now that seems very crazy, right? But the reality is, here's a person who went through civil rights, who got hooked on drugs, who has not been able to get past that because of the artificially created poverty that he grew up around. And now he's talking about, do I have gas money to get back here? I have to pay him to get him back home because he's my blood, right? And so even though you may see successful athletes that make it big, they also have to pay payments back to their loved ones who haven't made it out of artificial poverty. So this whole idea of racial economics, and this is kind of the meat of this conversation, historical choice architecture. So choice architecture is very interesting. This is a setup to create an environment where a deterministic point of view will happen. So say, for example, we order a steak. There's a medium steak, there's a small steak, and a big steak. Most people will go to the medium steak, and the people may know that, so they'll actually increase the profitability on that medium steak, knowing that you're going to be anchored in this bigger steak, right? It's a simple example of that. Now, when we think about historical choice architecture, by putting black and brown contributors artificially into environments where there's liquor stores right next to elementary schools and all these different things that happen like that, there's an assumption that why people are there is because of their own personal choices. That if they could just pick themselves up by the bootstraps that we hear so much about, that somehow they'll be able to get out of it. But it's a framing that says the problem is not my problem, the problem is your problem, because if you only. And we see that that's not really the case. The second is this BIPOC anchoring heuristic. The anchoring heuristic is a point of reference that is like a burden of proof, essentially. So, for example, I have to prove to people when I step into an environment that I am not a low-life, degenerate thug who is hell-bent on making sure that I can, depress my local environment. And then I have to apply for a job, right? And then when I'm at this job, I have to constantly prove to my boss and to others that I can talk professional, which really means I can talk white. So what the data shows is that this burden, this cognitive burden placed on these contributors is something that most of us don't think about when we come to work because we're just coming to work. But that's a cognitive burden that black and brown contributors come to work every day. Are they saying the wrong thing? Are they going to offend the person because they're not culturally aware or they don't have friends of color? And so then that burden of proof is not on the other contributors, it's on us. And what science has shown is that there is the same symptoms that veterans come back from war with PTSD is what many contributors of color deal with every day. They have PTSD and they show up to work. Imagine, if for you will, that this whole room was all black and brown, and you're the only white person in that room. How does that feel? Now, imagine, if you will, you're now forced to contribute, and you still have that burden of being the only person in that room that's white. It causes an effect on your ability to perform, right? Many black and brown contributors also know that in order to get jobs that our white counterparts get, we have to be 3 times better than our peers. In fact, oftentimes, it's white contributors are able to learn a job. Black and brown contributors have to already be there before they get the job. That's backwards, right? So there's all kind of things that we need to think about. And I'm not here to put blame or shame on people. This is a problem that we're all facing. And I'm saying that we can solve the problem better if we all start with a simple act of, I want to get to know you, Paul. I want to get to know who you are, who your family is, what are the concerns that you have. Let's build a friendship, and hopefully we can solve this problem together. The last one is society availability heuristic. This goes back to seeing the successful people that have been out there, and you can only call to mind to a certain group. Like you see, former President Obama and others, and say, hey, they're successful. That must mean everybody else is successful. So I want to talk about this idea of cultural residency. In the next week or so, you guys are going to read this book, White Fragility. I want to put a little disclaimer out there. White fragility might make you feel a little guilty, right? It's important to read, but it's also important in the context. But I'm saying this point because if you only do book knowledge, that's head knowledge. It doesn't go to your heart. You need to have experiential learning as a part of this. Try a new culture's food. Sit in an environment that you feel uncomfortable with. If you're Republican, talk to a Democrat. If you're Democrat, talk to a Republican. Go to places where you just are out of place, right? And then develop this cultural residency. We would never have a doctor go straight from med school to do open heart surgery. But yet, when it comes to this issue of racial inequality and justice, we have people going from reading books to trying to make things happen automatically, skipping, again, the relationship step. So if you do a cultural residency, you can get more out of cultural residency by being more intentional about where you spend your dollars and what kind of conversations you have than you can if you pay a consultant to come in and identify where your racial gaps are. Why? Because it's experiential. You know better, and now becomes co-created. After you move beyond reading books and to that point, and now you're actually getting into the real work of getting things done, you realize that you're going to get better results because you know the people you're talking to. As an entrepreneur, you wouldn't just go out there and say, I think I know what my customers want. You have to talk to your customers to figure out what they want. Otherwise, you're going to be a nonprofit organization, right? Excuse me. So really, the call to action that I have for a lot of folks is, we have, in the Twin Cities, we have a tremendous opportunity here in front of us. We were known for George Floyd. We were known for having the worst graduation rates for students of color. We were known for having for being the fourth worst ranked place for people of color to live. Why? See, instead of jumping to conclusion and say, well, there must be just racism alone, we have to do the thick thinking to realize what is the actual cause of this and how can we solve this. How am I doing time, by the way? I get passionate.
10 minutes.
Okay, wow, I talk fast. Yeah, there you go. And so here's an opportunity. We're talking to firms in Silicon Valley. We're talking to folks in Wall Street. Brown Venture Group, we really like to have this narrative from our community be changed, right? Invest into Brown Venture Group. Let us invest into communities of color. Let's co-create success. But don't just invest into us. Make our businesses a part of the supply chain. And that's hard to do because right now we have to manage risk and things like that. Guess what? Those risk assessments didn't factor in people of color. So what does that mean? We have to recreate onboarding diverse talent pipeline. We have to recreate what it means to onboard diverse suppliers, right? So yes, invest into Brown Venture Group, but also how can we move past economic stage 1 to economic stage 2? And that is the supply chain, right? So this is part of that. And the third thing is the relational aspect of things. Now, I'm not saying that you have to go way be outside of your comfort zone. People say all the time, you gotta get outside your comfort zone. Now, let's hold on a second here. What are you already good at? Right? What is the thing that you can do that's really excellent? And then how can that thing be applied to the communities of color? Don't go out and build homes if you don't know how to build homes. I know we love doing that for service projects and things like that, but I'm not a carpenter, right? If you are an investor, teach investment. If you are in sales, teach sales, right? Don't go beyond. You don't have to solve world hunger or solve racism all by yourself. That's never going to happen. It's one relationship at a time. It's one conversation at a time. And it's taking what you're already good at and applying it to your culture around you. So that is the simplest way to figure out what next. Well, you start with what you're good at. And secondly, is this relationships. I say it over and over again, relationships. Stop doing things for communities of color, and let's shift our thinking to do things with communities of color. The cognitive biases that plague us all, nobody's excluded from it, is the thing we have to be really way more intentional. The reality is, the reason why I started studying the subject of behavioral science was because I wanted to know my own self. I was impulsive. I tend to buy things differently. My wife was like, why'd you do that? I'm like, I don't know. I wanted to know. Instead of pointing the finger at everyone else and saying, you need to fix yourself, I had to fix myself. I had to understand what I was dealing with so that I can become a better contributor. Because now that I know myself a lot better, I know how to respond to my fellow citizen. That makes sense? So maybe I'll have more time for questions here because I think this is an important topic. And I know people may have questions that they want answered. I'll try my best. Was that 5 minutes?
About 8 minutes.
3 minutes for questions. There you
I appreciate you coming and thank you very much for what you've said. I heard you use the phrase artificial poverty, and I'm wondering if you can explain that concept of artificial poverty.
Certainly. So the question was, can I explain this for Zoom people, the concept of artificial poverty? What do I mean by artificial poverty? So when you study economics, the idea is that talent and capital will find the best, the best and brightest essentially from that space. Artificial poverty was policies that were created that, if not there would be better flourishing. For example, black code said you couldn't vote, you couldn't have certain jobs. And if you left the state where you're at, you had vagrancy laws, which means you'd be locked up. So that's a form of a system that created poverty from that standpoint of view. Second part of this is the cost of capital. It actually costs more money to be broke than it does to be rich, right? And the cost of goods and services in poverty-stricken areas have a higher cost of capital than they do outside of that. Again, that's artificially created because of the environment. When redlining occurred, they put these communities next to industrial places that had toxic fumes, humming. Now kids get greater asthma. You've seen the statistics around the black and brown contributors being affected by COVID more. Why was that? Because of where the communities were at, right? And then when it came time to actually contributors who actually could afford to live in these communities during redlining and others, they were kicked out. Not because they were not good citizens or pay their dues, but because simply other folks didn't want them in the community, even though they could afford to. So that artificially created, poverty from generation to generation. And when people think about hiring talent as an example, this is what I hear all the time. Dr. Campbell, I really want to hire the most qualified talent, but I just can't find them. They don't have what I need. Where did the problem start? It didn't start when they applied for the job. It started when they were trying to get their first job. And they couldn't get it because they maybe dressed a certain way, and they didn't get on the playing field. We know that experience is super important to gain wealth. In fact, John D. Rockefeller, that's what he did when he was in Cleveland when he was younger. 16 years old, he would go around from place to place trying to find a job. Couldn't find it. He just went back to the top of his list. All he wanted was experience so that he can eventually become a contributor. So that's what I mean by artificial poverty, where there are policies and systems in place that if they weren't there, there would be greater economic and human flourishing from that perspective? Good question. Yes, sir.
In Minneapolis, you talked about the dropout rate or the education level. Are schools like Hope Academy, and there's some others, I want to say Agnes Day, but that's not right. There's some through the Roman Catholic.
Crystal Ray.
Thank you, Crystal Ray. Are they contributing? Are they helping this? Are you aware of them, and are they helping this? Is that a step in the right direction?
So the question was, are schools like Hope Academy and Agnes Grace, did I hear that right? Crystal Grace, are they helping? I know that I have friends who go attend that school. Here's the thing again. I'll pick on the faith community a little bit. Bear with me a little bit. I started my professional career actually in ministry, full disclosure. My grandpa was a pastor, my dad was a pastor, my mom lives in Africa right now as a missionary, right? Big hearts. Sometimes they're not connecting to the mind in terms of solving a problem. So why do we go down to the inner city? We come back and we say, oh, I'm so blessed that to live where I live. I feel so bad for those less fortunate people, right? So faith communities are not excluded from this conversation. In fact, I'm helping my church walk through this very thing. How do we change the language, the lenses? What are the more important thing is, what are the lenses cognitively that actually influence the way I see communities of color? That influence that, are they a project? Are they a ministry project? Or are they potential partners? Hope Academy does great work, don't get me wrong. But I challenge everybody to think about their thinking. It's called metacognition. And what comes to mind when you're trying to solve problems? I heard somebody say that poverty is an industry. And every industry has an economic incentive to keep itself around. So when you think about, sometimes when people they do good work with their heart, sometimes they're not connecting with their mind. My mom's, I love her to death, but sometimes she's one of them. We go back and forth. This is what I said to my mom. Okay, you're in Africa. You're trying to plant churches. Why not plant businesses that support churches? You create a job. That's one of the most spiritual things you can do, right? Then those people can support the church. Now, those of us who have a similar faith tradition I have, you look at the miracles that were talked about in the Bible, right? Every miracle is meet a practical need. People were sick, they need to be healed. They were hungry, they need to be fed. So we skip past the practical side of things to make ourselves feel good about this emotional, like I help these less fortunate children. But why are they less fortunate? My thing is not that we shouldn't do these things. It's let's not stop at dealing with symptoms. Let's go to the root causes of these things and then co-create the solution together. Next question? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Rotary is a huge organization of business professionals.
He's about to name me out.
Yeah. Rotary is a huge organization of business and community leaders around the world, and certainly in our state. And we have both the expertise and the capital to do certain things to assist in unleashing the production from the African American community. What is something our organization could do on a base level to start? Could be something relational or otherwise, in your opinion?
Well, I think even when it comes to organizations like you, that's great that they want to do that. Because there's a learning curve with relationship, I arguably say invest in the Brown Venture Group and then come alongside us and help launch these companies where we can co-create these solutions together, because they're going to need coaching, they're going to need mentoring, but I can find mentors for days. It's investment that sparks the capital, that gets them off the ground. That's super important. But I don't want you to stop and just give money, come down and build relationships, because long term, we're going to see a better Twin Cities when all of our contributors are reaching their full potential. Thank you so much.